Coming up on this episode of Greyhound Nation, guest Charlie Blanning shares some famous Greyhound stories that are begging to be made into the next big movie or miniseries. Netflix? HBO? Are you listening? Stay tuned. The Nation is next. This is Greyhound Nation, episode 19, recorded July 17th, 2021, bringing famous Greyhound stories to the big screen. Greyhound Nation is a podcast for Greyhound enthusiasts produced by Greyhound enthusiasts. To learn more about our show and its hosts, visit our website at greyhoundnation.dog. That's greyhoundnation.dog. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Greyhound Nation podcast. I'm Michael Burns. Now here's your host, John Parker.
Welcome back, everybody. You know, over the years, I've noticed that Greyhound lovers, in large part, are also horse lovers, particularly thoroughbred racehorses, possibly because of the parallels between the Greyhound and the racehorse. And I've also noticed that Hollywood has made quite a few movies about some great horses of history. Some examples are Far Lap, Seabiscuit, Secretariat, Dreamer, 50 to 1, all good movies about horses. And it struck me that they've missed the boat because there's some great Greyhound stories that would make really excellent movies. So I thought, well, let's talk a little bit about some of those stories and why they would make a great movie. And I've asked our frequent guest, Charlie Blanning, Greyhound historian and author, to join us for an episode. We've given him an unlimited budget to make these movies, and he's going to tell us a few stories that would make great yarns for Hollywood to consider for some movies. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you very much, John. It's great to be back with you.
Let's jump right in, and you've selected some Greyhounds of history whose stories were fascinating. Let's start with the first one.
Well, I think we have to start with Master McGrath, the great Irish greyhound which won the Waterloo Cup back in the 19th century 3 times in 4 years. He was a legend in his own lifetime. He was a hero in the country of his birth in Ireland. And in fact, he became so celebrated that he was presented by Queen Victoria's request, presented to the Queen at Windsor Castle after his final and third win in the Waterloo Cup. So it's a story with great dramatic moments and also, of course, surrounded by myth, because like all the best stories, there are various versions which don't often agree. But at least, of course, with a film, a scriptwriter can take all the various bits of source material and put them together and come up with a story which will grab an audience. And I'm absolutely sure that Master McGrath, as far as Greyhound stories are concerned, has virtually got every element that you could want.
Yeah, you know, the horse movies often concentrate not only on the horse itself, but on the horse's connections, whether it was the breeder, the owner, the trainer, the jockey, etc. And often those people had fascinating stories that were part of the horse's life story. So what was it about Master McGrath that kind of fits that picture?
Well, the thing about Master McGrath is that his story introduces something which is now very, very fashionable, at least in United Kingdom, as far as TV miniseries are concerned. So that in series such as, I know you've watched yourself, Downton Abbey, which was enormously popular in the UK and also was turned into a feature film, you have a period historical romance in which the life of the people, as they say, above stairs is mixed with the story of the people below stairs, so that you have this tension, you might even say, between the high life, which was enjoyed by people in the late 1800s, and the entirely different life, of course, which was enjoyed by their servants and the general populace. And there's no doubt that, I mean, the Waterloo Cup, as everyone said at the time, you would be attracting crowds there of sometimes 60,000 people a day to watch the coursing. All human life was there. Every strata of society, every kind of person, and it could, of course, make an enormously colourful background to a film.
So, who were the upstairs and the downstairs participants in Master McGrath's story?
Well, upstairs you had, first of all, his titular owner, Lord Lurgan, who was a peer of the realm, and he had a very large estate in what is now Northern Ireland, near the town of Lurgan. They were an extremely wealthy family because they'd emigrated to the north of Ireland sometime in the 16th century, and they made a fortune from flax. Flax was one of the great crops grown in Northern Ireland at the time, and the flax industry was extremely profitable, and it financed Lord Lurgan's, the name of the family was Brownlow. They were the Brownlows. Lurgan was the title. And it's the fortune which they derived from their estates and from the flax industry financed Lord Lurgan's pretty extravagant expenditure on things like greyhounds and gambling.
And as I recall, he didn't just dabble in greyhounds. He was an active coursing man that hosted meetings and was involved in breeding and all the aspects of greyhounds and coursing.
Yes, absolutely everything. And he ran a huge meeting on his own estate at Lurgan. In fact, in ways, it would be possible to say they were the greatest coursing meetings ever run on the island of Ireland of any kind. The standard program was for 364 dog stakes, and these were stakes which were run in what we would call open coursing, not in closed coursing, as you would find, say, at Clonmel in Ireland today, or you would have found, say, 50 years ago at Abilene in Kansas, where the hares were captive and trained to run in an enclosed running ground. These meetings that Lord Lurgan promoted were run in open country, so that the hares lived absolutely wild and free. Very much, of course, and this was his model for his meetings, very much like the Waterloo Cup itself. And in fact, the Lurgan meetings were always referred to as the Waterloo Cups of Ireland at the time.
Now, in many of these horse movies that I've referenced, the horse often had very humble beginnings. Tell us a little bit about Master McGrath's beginnings.
Yes, well, Master McGrath fulfills every myth necessary in a romantic greyhound story. And the first thing that you have to have in a romantic greyhound story is that when the greyhound is born, he always has to be the smallest and the most sickly of the litter. And there always has to be a threat that someone will say, put the little one down, drown it, or whatever. And in Master McGrath is no exception. I mean, there are at least 2 or 3 different stories about how he was what we rudely call the runt of the litter, and how the man who bred him said, we can't be bothering to rear this. And then, of course, inevitably in these stories, the little puppy is nursed back to health, preferably by a small boy, and then proves to be a great champion. Well, with Master McGrath, hey, it all happened. So you don't have to make it up. The story is there for everyone. And because Lord Lurgan said, and this is the basis of the story, Queen Victoria, who knew Lord Lurgan, not just from when they took Master McGrath to Windsor Castle to be presented to her, but she knew him as an important and influential courtier at the time. She said, why was he called Master McGrath? And Lord Lurgan replied that he had been named after a little orphan, excuse me, little orphan boy who had brought him up. So not only do you have the small child saving and nursing future champion, but he also turns out to be an orphan as well. I mean, you really can't top that, can you?
How did he come to be in? How did Master McGrath come to be in possession and to be reared by the orphan boy?
Well, he was his breeder was a man called James Galway, and James Galway was a great friend and associate of Lord Lurgan. And in fact, James Galway used to breed all Lord Lurgan's dogs for him, much further south in the island of Ireland, in County Waterford, between Waterford and Clonmel. So Master McGrath was just one of the litters, and Johnny McGrath, as he's normally named as, the orphan boy, Johnny McGrath, the orphan boy, was one of James, the son of one of James Galway's tenant farmers. And the puppies were put out for the farmers to rear on James Galway's estate. And then when they eventually came to maturity and started to run, they were run in Lord Lurgan's name, not James Galway's, because all Lord Lurgan's dogs were called Master this and Master that, and all his bitches were called Lady this and Lady that. And they ran in Lord Lurgan's name, not James Galway's.
And then there's a story that would, the boy and his dog type stories that Johnny McGrath trained Master McGrath to jump ditches, and that became important in coursing. Tell us about that.
Well, it was absolutely vital because particularly running in the Waterloo Cup at Altcar at the time, Altcar was crisscrossed by drainage ditches. It's that the land is very close to the sea. Near Liverpool in Lancashire, and the ground was crossed in those days by even more ditches than it is today. And if a dog didn't jump a ditch and follow the hare, then it had absolutely no chance of winning. And the story is that Johnny McGrath, there was ditches on the farmland where the boy lived, and he would whistle the dog across the ditches, teaching it to sling the ditches as quickly as possible so that it wouldn't lose any ground when it was actually running for real in a proper coursing state. And it became absolutely vital, funnily enough, in the second Waterloo Cup, which Master McGrath won. He came up against a famous bitch called Babbitt the Bowster, and they ran on the field called the Withens, which until 2005 was still the field where the finals of the Waterloo Cup were decided. And in those days, there was a ditch halfway up the field. And before the finalists would meet the hare, they had to jump this ditch. And Master McGrath jumped it fluently. The bitch hesitated fatally. Master McGrath turned the hare first and went on to win the course. And that's how he won his second Waterloo Cup.
I think this would probably make instead of a movie, maybe a Netflix series. I don't think you could fit a 2-hour movie, Master McGrath's story into a regular 2-hour movie.
No, because as they always say these days, and there's much, much more. Because even more exciting was actually the year in which he was beaten. And he won the Waterloo Cup in his first season of running as a puppy. And then he won it the second year. That was in 1869 when he beat Babbitt the Bowster. And then in 1870, there are all sorts of conflicting rumors and legends of why poor Master McGrath got beaten. And one of them was that he ate an old boot on the night before. I know, on the night before the first day of the Waterloo Cup, he ate an old boot. I can't imagine why. I'm sure the dog was properly fed. And then another one was that many years after the running of these cups, and the master himself being dead for years, an Irish bookmaker admitted that he'd have the dog dote.
That's amazing.
To stop him winning.
Yeah.
And by which, of course, Lord Lurgan, who was an extremely heavy gambler, would have, lost a small fortune. So it was, but that's not that's only the start of it. In 80, he then, on the first day when he was beaten by an extremely good bitch actually called Lady Lyons, and she was no pushover. It was extremely bad weather. It was very cold at Altcar that year. The ground was covered in ice and snow, and the master falls into one of the drainage ditches and becomes trapped under the ice, so that an Irishman, an Irish slipper, jumps into the ditch and smashes the ice around the dog to save his life. So, I mean, how much more drama do you want?
Now we're going to make you the casting director. Who would you cast in that movie?
Oh, I don't know. I think, because of the success of these period costume dramas, of which British television is so fond, they churn them out at a great rate. They're always terribly successful and terribly popular. I think we'd probably have to go straight to the cast of Downton Abbey and simply drag them out again. Hugh Bonneville would surely have to play Lord Lurgan. I'm sure that we could find a part for Jim Carter, who plays the butler in Downton Abbey. He can be the trainer, I should think. And we create a part for Maggie Smith as the domineering, probably Lady Sefton or something like that. So, and because there are endless Irish actors who can be immediately whistled up. I'm thinking of, Liam Neeson, Pierce Brosnan, and there's a splendid chap who you might not know, who's very funny, called Chris O'Dowd. We'd have to find a part for Chris O'Dowd. There's so many good Irish actors at the moment that you'll be spoiled for choice. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, we need to get this episode to Julian Fellows of Downton Abbey fame, who basically created the show and is the screenwriter and so forth. He could eat this up with his period costume and class distinction pieces, couldn't he?
Well, apart from anything else, you see, because apart from the the outdoor scenes and the scenes in the Irish countryside, of course, Master McGrath's infancy and growing to maturity and so on and so forth, you've got Lord Lurgan, who was incredibly grand, and he lived at Brownlow House, just outside the town of Lurgan. In fact, in one of the famous paintings of Master McGrath, you can see the house in the background, in the landscape. And Lord and Lady Lurgan was so grand that they had an enormous banqueting hall, and they had a special staircase which led from the floor above down into the banqueting room, so that after all their guests had assembled, for the grand dinner which was being given, Lord and Lady Lurgan would descend this special staircase into the banqueting room from a different entrance to everyone else, so that they could be, bowed to and saluted and so on and so
The grand entrance, so to speak.
the grand entrance. Yes, and imagine the costumes as well. Goodness, they'd run. And the costume department would run riot, absolutely run riot.
Well, let's move on to another great Greyhound story that you might have in mind. Tell us about the next one.
Brigadier, yes, because the other important element, I think, of any Greyhound story, and you get it in the Master McGrath story, the little orphan boy who raises the rejected greyhound, of course, is rags to riches. There's nothing better, of course, in cinema than a rags to riches story. Cinderella has a great deal to answer for. So that a great dog called Brigadier, he won the Waterloo Cup. And the story goes that Brigadier was found by a man called Thomas Fawkes, who was a milkman on the edge of Manchester, already a great manufacturing industrial city. Anyway, Thomas Fawkes is jogging along in his little cart early one morning, delivering milk, and he's followed by a starving greyhound, and a starving white and black greyhound. Anyway, Mr. Fawkes takes the greyhound, takes him, the stray, in and feeds him up. And everyone says, "That's a good dog, Tom. You better go and run that at the such and such coursing meeting." And he does. And of course, it proves to be a brilliant greyhound. And he's given an entry for the Waterloo Cup, and he wins it. And not only that, but he landed some very considerable bets as well. So that Thomas Fawkes, the Manchester milkman, becomes very rich by his standards overnight. Brigadier was also a very influential stud dog. So the Fawkes family derived a very good income from that as well. And he builds a hotel, which was called the Waterloo. And that stood, when did they pull it down? Until about 20 or 30 years ago in a suburb of Manchester called Withington. And there's still a plaque on the wall. They pulled the poor old pub down and built a housing estate on it, as they tend to do these days. And there is a plaque on the wall telling the story.
And would the milkman been the one who named Brigadier?
Well, that's a very good point, because, of course, as ever with these things, rather like many of the legends about Master McGrath, there's another story as well, which contradicts the famous legend. And that was that actually that Fawkes didn't find Brigadier in the street, that he bought him for little money off a man who had been training greyhounds for a big owner, and without the big owner's permission, he sold him at a low price just to put some cash in his pocket. But thankfully, no one quite knows what the real truth was.
The gambling aspect alone gives rise to all manner of shenanigans that might have been weaved into a movie line.
Oh yes, because let's face it, I mean the very few films which have been made about greyhounds and greyhound racing, of course, all show it is a very shady business in which villainous bookmakers and villainous gamblers are up to all sorts of appalling tricks, so that everyone would have the impression that the greyhound racing was completely beyond the pale. I can remember watching there's a film, I think it's made in 1941, called Johnny Eager, in which Robert Taylor, of all people, who I always thought played romantic lead parts, appears as a gangster called Johnny Eager. And, guess what? What does Johnny Eager do to get his ill-gotten gains? He runs a greyhound track. And thankfully to satisfy all current morality, he dies in the last reel. He's shot dead in the street. So, but there's rather a nice greyhound in it called Gypsies.
Yes, I remember watching that.
Yeah, nice picture of them together. But
it's not really known who was the greyhound a great racer, or it was just somebody a greyhound that could be easily trained.
I don't know. I don't know. All it has to do, like most greyhounds, of course, and you don't have to teach them to do this. They do this entirely naturally. Is that they just stare into their owner's eyes, don't they? Oh, that stare, and you can refuse them nothing then.
So, Brigadier and Humble Beginnings. That's another great theme. Who else do you have in mind?
Well, I think the one I would like to do most, because Master McGrath is so well known, is a bitch called Snowflight, who won the Waterloo Cup in 1881. And there again, of course, she combines all the various elements that you want from a romantic story. We've got rags to riches. We've got people making their humble people making their fortune. We've got unscrupulous gamblers. We've got unscrupulous greyhound trainers who dope their dogs. Everything. I mean, it's absolutely sensational, and it was all true.
So what's Snowflight's story about that?
Well, what happened with Snowflight was Snowflight was bred by a man called William Cutter in the coal mining districts just north of Newcastle in northeast England. And at the time, in the early 1880s, a desperately poor place. Mr. Cutter lived at a place called Guidepost. The Guidepost is still there today, but in the 1880s, Guidepost was a colliery village, and as they said, they had more pubs than chapels in Guidepost at the time, and I think one lavatory was shared between 40 families. Typhus was rife. Actually terrible place. And anyway, Mr. Cotter breeds a litter of puppies, and one of them is this little bitch called Snowflight, and he has to make a run for it because his creditors are after him. And before he runs off to New Zealand, would you believe? You would have thought that was far enough. He gives Snowflight away to a farmer called Thomas Hall, and Thomas Hall is given the bitch to kill rabbits with. So you know what happens next. Of course, everyone will be ahead of me. Snowflight is tried. She turns out to be show brilliant promise. She's taken to Gosforth Park, which was the great coursing enclosure at Newcastle the day. Thousands of miners would attend the meetings and gamble, and she proves an absolute star, and she's nominated for the Waterloo Cup, which she duly wins for Mr. Thomas Hall, the lowly farmer. So there we are. I'm absolutely wonderful. Cinderella has gone to the ball, and she's married, married Prince Charming. It's got the lot. But unfortunately for Snowflight, that's not where the story ends, because then Mr. Hall sells Snowflight to an unknown group of gamblers. And right up until the next Waterloo Cup, the following year in 1882, no one knows who has actually got her and who actually owns her. All they know is that Snowflight is somewhere and is being prepared for the Waterloo Cup. In those days, you had 64 nominators, as they were known. 64 gentlemen were entitled to run a dog in the Waterloo Cup. And when the betting opened on the Waterloo Cup, you didn't know which dog the nominator was going to, run himself in the great stake. So no one knows who's got Snowflight. No one knows which nomination to back if they want to back her. And they kept it a secret right up until the evening before the meeting, when they made the draw for the first round, when they drew the first pairs, which dog would run against which. And it was kept a secret all that time, simply so that they could lay as many long price bets as possible. And as it turned out, when the truth was known, there were rumors, of course, in the press. The press had gone crazy. Snowflight was now in the hands of Edward Dent, who later became famous for training Fullerton, probably the greatest greyhound of all time, and was in the name of a man called Will Riley, who kept a pub at Newmarket, the race horse capital, and who was known as a notorious gambler. And they'd backed Snowflight pounds, shillings, and pence to win the Waterloo Cup for the second time. So the last day dawns. Snowflight is in the final. She can't be beaten. And when they take her to slips for the final course, she is so excited and so off ahead they can hardly get her into slips. And when eventually the dogs are released, she leads her opponent up to the hare by a distance. But unfortunately, the hare decides to turn round. Snowflight, who's, we think, has been, overstimulated, to put it in a euphemism, runs straight on. And the other greyhound, much slower, of course, gets behind the hare and works off all the points and is signalled the winner, and Snowflight is beaten.
And it might be a bit of a challenge to cast a greyhound in Snowflight's role. She had some unusual markings, didn't she?
Yes, she did. She was called Snowflight because she was a black bitch, but she had what we in greyhounds call ticks. She was a black and white ticked bitch, which means that she had little dabs of white through her coat. And that's why, of course, she was called Snowflight, because it looked like the flecks of snow, against the black. Lovely bitch, beautiful bitch. But she was not well served by her new friends. It actually says in the coursing calendar, which I wrote for 20 or 30 years, was known for its discretion. I mean, you never said anything out of place, because you're always afraid of being sort of taken up for it. It was perfectly plain. It actually stated it felt that it said something about Edward Dent, who was at the very beginning of his career of training. And it said, wiser heads than he who had charge of the crack know the danger of giving stimulants.
And of course, back then they didn't have the anti-doping rules that they have now, which is in British coursing was zero tolerance, essentially, wasn't it?
Well, absolutely right. And of course, the stimulant of choice at the end of the 19th century, not just for greyhounds, this was for horses, and I might add, racing cyclists as well, was strychnine, which of course is a dangerous poison. But if it's given in very small amounts, it's also a fierce stimulant. And one would suspect that at that era that probably they used strychnine.
Amazing, and it's very likely that if they hadn't dosed Snowflight for that last Waterloo Cup that she ran in, she would have won it.
Yeah, if they'd left her alone, she'd have won it easily, because she was a very good greyhound. she wasn't just a mad dasher. In most of her courses, she could run a hare as good as anyone. But it was very obvious to everyone watching her. They actually carried her into slips.
Amazing. Well, let's
Yeah.
move on to the next one. Who you got in mind for the next star of the screen?
Well, I think we must get to the era of track racing, mustn't we?
Yes.
And I mean, we won't pause long over him because they actually made a film with Mick the Miller, the legendary, the legend of early greyhound racing in the United Kingdom. Mick the Miller actually appeared in a feature film. So you can if you get hold of a copy, it's the most marvelous film. I think it's made in 1934. Mick starred in his own film, and you get all the various tropes of greyhound and racing stories. As usual, we've got the villainous people that are trying to stop. It's called Wild Boy, trying to stop Wild Boy, played by Mick Miller, from winning the Greyhound Derby. And one of the standard tropes, as you'll probably know, of racing stories, horse racing stories, as well as greyhound stories, is that the heroic animal always goes missing. It's kidnapped. Nat Gould, who was the early master of horse racing stories, someone would always get kidnapped. If the horse didn't get kidnapped, then the romantic interest, the girl, got kidnapped, and they were if such and such a horse ran in the derby, she would meet a sticky end, and so on and so forth. Or alternatively, they'd steal the favourite, and he would go missing, so on and so forth. Anyway, in Wild Boy gets stolen or kidnapped so often. At one point, his trainer says, exasperated, someone says, "Oh, sir, Wild Boy's gone missing." "Oh, no, not again," he says. It's not the most convincing story, but there's the most beautiful girl who plays the romantic interest, and there's Mick the Miller himself, who's the sweetest dog. You can tell that, from the film itself. He really does plays the part. You even have a bit of coursing. A sort of staged Waterloo Cup starts the film, and then you get some marvelous archive film of racing at the White City, which was the great stadium in London, where the Greyhound Derby took place. Where on finals night, when Mick the Miller was running, you'd have 80 or 90,000 people there.
What in Mick's actual story? What are some good plot lines from his story?
Well, from his story, of course, we're back with it again. He's born in very humble circumstances, in the depths of the Irish countryside. He's bred by a Catholic priest called Father Brophy, and then he's trained by a well-known Irish vet called, sorry, not an Irish vet, trained by a chap called Mick Horan, who was a coursing slipper at the time. And they run him in Ireland. He proves successful. They take him over to England to run in the Greyhound Derby, and he duly wins. He won the Derby two years running, but by that time he had been sold, and he was sold to a society lady, if we can use that expression, a lady called Fiddy Kempton, and her husband, Arundel Hugh Kempton, was a director of the Wimbledon Greyhound Stadium, and Mrs. Kempton and Mick the Miller are a feature, a sort of a standing dish in all the society magazines of the time, like the Illustrated London News and the Tatler and so on and so forth. And she was a very attractive girl, which didn't hurt, as Mick's trainer once said. And so Mick had all the coverage that was going in the picture magazine, the pictorial magazines of the time. But he won the Derby twice. He won another classic, the St. Leger, and of course everyone loved him because he was such a personality.
Yeah.
He was one of those waggy dogs. He always wagged his tail, and the more the crowd cheered, the more he wagged it.
Wasn't there a great story about they paraded him in front of the large crowds upon his retirement? Am I thinking of the right Greyhound?
Yes, you've got him. They always used to have at the Derby and the Derby final before the finalists came out on the track. They would have a parade of previous winners, and Mick was being paraded as the winner in 1929 and 1930. And as they led him past the traps, he lunged to get into them because he wanted to run, which is, for those of the we can only call them the antis against greyhound racing. I mean, this is the dog which actually tried to clamber into the traps, so he could race. I mean, that's what he loved doing.
And he was years after his final race, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. I think he'd been retired for 2 or 3 years by then. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There seems to be I seem to recall a picture of Mick the Miller with some puppies that he sired and
yes.
his beautiful lady owner.
Yes. Oh, the beautiful lady owner was always in it. And she was a dish. There's no doubt about that. And of course, always beautifully dressed in those sort of fabulous 1930s clothes and hats. The photographs are many and various. Mostly in their garden. They lived in Wimbledon in a very lush house, and Mick was always being photographed in the garden with all his puppies or his trophies, or it was great. If he hadn't existed, we would have to have invented him.
Yes. Who would you pick to play Mrs. Kempton?
Oh, well, there you are. I don't know. I'm a bit out of touch these days. I still think of films in black and white. So I'm, I'd line up any of my old favorites, like Julie Christie and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a British actress named Emily Blunt who played Queen Victoria in a series, and she was in several others. She would probably make a good one, wouldn't she?
Yeah, she's a very pretty girl. We'll have her out again as Queen Victoria for Master McGrath, I think, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to the next one. Who's your next movie candidate?
Well, of course, you're in America, and I'm here in England, and we haven't talked about an American dog yet. So we would have to talk about Mission Boy, who was the star of of all the early tracks. Mission Boy raced everywhere. There wasn't a greyhound track in the States in the early 1920s where Mission Boy didn't turn up and where Mission Boy didn't run. And he had the most amazing record. As usual, of course, the records are now lost in the mists of time. It doesn't matter how many newspaper archives you go through, you can't entirely get to the bottom of what he actually did. But a chap called Jack Fisher, who was the racing manager at several of those early tracks, particularly in Florida, Jack Fisher always claimed that Mission Boy won 47 races in a row.
Is that true? Is that been authenticated?
You can't authenticate it. I've stared at the newspaper archives, and I can't quite get to the bottom of it. But it is certainly very true that he didn't get beaten very often, and towards the end of his career, when he did get beaten in some enormous races, for the Hialeah Derby and things like that, they were also running him, would you believe, over half a mile. Those early derbies, which they used to run in Florida, were run twice around the track, 880 yards, half a mile. So it's not surprising that poor old Mission Boy, who by that stage was about 6 or 7 years old, was starting to run out of puff.
Yeah.
Anyway, eventually they retired him. But he was an absolutely amazing greyhound. Wonderful, wonderful dog. And when they retired him, by the way, he went off to live with Jack Dempsey.
The boxer.
Yeah, the heavyweight champion, because Dempsey had close connections with O.P. Smith and the pioneers of greyhound racing, because the first greyhound track, as the world and wife knows, was at Emeryville, outside Oakland in California. And in a couple of years before Emeryville greyhound racing started, Dempsey used to box at the Emeryville boxing stadium frequently. It's one of the places where he made his name. And he was a big pal of all the greyhound racing crowd. So anyway, when Mission Boy retired, he went off to live with Jack.
Was he given to Jack Dempsey, or did Dempsey buy him to have him at stud?
I think he was given to him, and eventually, because Dempsey was so tied up with his boxing career at the time, of course, he returned. He lived out his last days with the Lawrence Freeman family in Tulsa. Lawrence Freeman was the man who trained him for most of his career. But his career, it started in California on the coursing field. And then he raced at Emeryville, then he raced at Tulsa, then he raced at St. Louis, then he raced at Chicago, then he raced in Miami. And so, so it went on. Talk about an odyssey. Wherever there was greyhound racing, there was Mission Boy, and the crowds loved him.
How would he have traveled back then, Charlie? Railroad?
They went by railroad. Yes, they had special trains. There are quite a lot of reports in the newspapers of the period. For instance, because they had seasons, when a season ended, say in Miami, all the trainers and all the dogs and all the equipment, I think probably, would be put on a special train, and it would chuff off to wherever the next big meeting was going to be, which was frequently at East St. Louis.
Well, you could weave, even though it didn't happen, that never stops the movie makers from taking a little cinematic license. You could have a train, a heist to steal some greyhounds, among which was Mission Boy.
Well, let's hope so. Yes, and someone would say, "Gee, he's disappeared. What? Not again." He was again. I think he was a lovely dog. Everyone loved him. He was known as Old Jerry.
Old Jerry.
Old Jerry. That was his pet name. Old Jerry. And there were all sorts of crazy rumors about him. One was that he wouldn't chase a live hare. Well, I know that's untrue because I read the report of when he appeared in the California Futurity at Merced on the coursing field before he ever went on the track. And more believable was that he loathed a racing muzzle. And for a long time, they allowed him to race without a muzzle.
Well, that could certainly be, an interesting twist to weave into it. That
yes.
He was given special dispensation on things because he was such a great dog.
Well,
how did they figure out from his coursing record that he might make a good track runner?
Well, I mean, the chap who bred him had a lot of dogs. There were a lot of greyhounds in California at the time, and there was a lot of coursing. And the biggest meetings were in the San Joaquin Valley at Merced. This was open coursing, by the way, not enclosed. It was open coursing. And of course, as soon as the Emeryville track opened, all the Californian boys, like the owner of the breeder of Mission Boy and George Heinz of the Oakland Kennels and things like that, I mean, they didn't hesitate, and of course took their dogs to Emeryville. And then, as you would know, the caravan moved on, and went off to Tulsa, which was the first really commercially successful dog track in America. And that was it. They were off. They needed as many dogs as they could get their hands on. But old Jerry, he was the best.
Oh, that's great.
And of course, by then he'd become very expensive because he changed hands. I think the first time he changed hands when he ran at Emeryville for $50, and Lawrence Freeman gave $1,500 for him at Tulsa.
Which in those days was quite a bit of money, wasn't it?
Yeah, in 1921, $1,500 was a lot of money.
Yeah, yeah.
But he was worth every penny.
Did Mission Boy go on to stud?
Yes, I think he had some litters, but I don't think he was particularly successful. You couldn't say that there was a particular greyhound who was by Mission Boy who was the champion, because the competition by then, of course, also was intense. They were importing hundreds of dogs from Ireland and from the UK to run on those early tracks. But and of course, Mick the Miller was no great shakes as a stud dog, I'm afraid, either. He did get some very good dogs, Mick. He got a very good bitch that won the St. Leger, but he wasn't the great success that everyone hoped that he would be. But that's not unusual after all in greyhound racing. It's not the Derby winners who prove to be the best stud dogs often. I don't know why that is.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Charlie, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the fact that at least the last two of our movie candidates are covered in your great book, Please, Mister,
Yes.
and with pictures and so forth. And I just want to tell our listeners that if you missed out on getting The Greyhound and the Hare, you've got a few copies left of Please, Mister, don't you, Charlie?
Yes, I have. Yeah. And it's for those of you who are lucky enough, this sounds rather vain, doesn't it? Lucky enough to have a copy of The Greyhound and the Hare, because people keep contacting me and asking me where they can buy one, and the answer is I can't help them. Since the original print run ran out, there's not been a sign of one secondhand or anything. Everyone who's got one has kept them. But Please, Mister, yep, it's still with us, still for sale. You can buy it on eBay. That's the easiest way, perhaps. It's there on eBay, and we're happy to ship wherever you are in the world. We send them everywhere. The States, Australia, New Zealand, everywhere.
Yeah, I've got any number of friends who have lamented to me, I should have listened to you and bought The Greyhound and the Hare, and now I want a copy and I can't get one. So, folks, don't let that happen to you with Please, Mister. It's a really great book. It's basically a smaller version of The Greyhound and the Hare, and it focuses on the golden age of greyhound racing, which was wonderful. So you can it's available on eBay, as Charlie said. It's also you can order it from your Facebook page, The Greyhound and the Hare, right, Charlie?
That's yes. Is it from direct from our Facebook page, or as I say, on eBay or on Amazon UK. One thing, John, we should perhaps mention, coming back to Mission Boy, thinking Please, Mister and Mission Boy, is of course what a movie it would make. It's not just an author thinking, oh my goodness me, could I sell the movie rights of Please, Mister? It's just, when you said how would you see some of these stories as films? And whereas with the story of Master McGrath, I see, of course, a British UK period drama full of gorgeous costumes and expensive houses and things like that. Please, Mister, because much of it is about the beginnings of greyhound racing, of course, which took place in the United States. And the film I keep seeing when I think of Please, Mister is The Grapes of Wrath. I see everyone sort of played by Henry Fonda. wearing a pair of those denim overalls that everyone wears, and it's just so much, like it's like a sort of modern Western, the way that greyhound racing started, and of course the influence of Kansas, where where a lot of the dogs came from to race on those original tracks at Tulsa and at East St. Louis. And a lot of the guys who were racing there came straight off the farm from Kansas, where already, particularly in the Depression years, and greyhound racing was a great industry for them, absolutely marvelous. But they could all those guys could be played by Henry Fonda.
Yeah, you could probably weave an appearance by O.P. Smith into Mission Boy's movie, couldn't you?
Oh, most certainly. Good Lord, yes. We couldn't miss out on O.P. Smith, the man who started it all, the man that we all should be grateful to. I'm not sure who we get to play O.P. Smith. He could have just a tinge of an Irish accent, of course.
Yeah.
Although they had come over to Memphis, that's where he came from, Tennessee originally. But they were Irish immigrants, the Smith family. Yeah, we'd have to cast O.P. And even better, Mrs. O.P.
Yes.
She looked a determined woman.
No doubt he put his hands on Mission Boy at some point.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yes. I mean, there's a marvelous photograph of Mission Boy after they had a Jack Dempsey Day at the track at O.P. Smith's track in Miami, and they had a Jack Dempsey Day. Thousands of people came out of Miami to see it, and Jack acted as one of the judges. Not that I think anyone took him very seriously, but there are lovely pictures of him in the judges' box and all the rest of it. And they ran a Jack Dempsey trophy. And there's a lovely photograph of them presenting the Jack Dempsey trophy to Lawrence Freeman, the trainer of Mission Boy. And O.P. Smith is just slightly off to the left, holding his straw hat, looking on, because there, of course, was the success of his great scheme. He had one of the most famous sportsmen in the country on his track, giving away the trophy to the legendary dog. You couldn't have arranged it better.
Yeah, maybe Josh Brolin to play Jack Dempsey. What do you think?
Is he big enough?
That's a good question. Yeah, he's definitely a tough guy.
Oh, right. Well, all these young actors these days, they all look as if they spend their whole lives in the gym. In the good old days, actors used to spend the whole time in the bar. Now they spend all their time in the gym, building up their muscles.
Is it likely that was the first time Jack Dempsey met Mission Boy? Was that trophy presentation?
I don't know, because of course he boxed. As I said, you see, O.P. Smith's great partner was George Sawyer, and George Sawyer, who had known O.P. Smith back from the coursing days, at the turn of the century back in South Dakota. George Sawyer was a boxing promoter in Oakland when the Emeryville track started, because the grandstand at the Greyhound track, they dismantled George Sawyer's boxing arena and carried it down the street and set it up again to act as the grandstand for the dog track. I kid you not, this is true. And Jack Dempsey had fought at George Sawyer's arena on several occasions. That's one of the places where he started to get noticed. So George Sawyer and O.P. Smith and Jack Dempsey were all old buddies. Yeah.
That's a great story. That's the beauty of all of these. Is there's so much interweaving of characters who played a role in greyhound racing and coursing and so forth, that you could go all day.
Oh, it's a great story. It's a marvelous story. I'm an Einstein staff, and I'm so glad I wrote the book. because it's such a marvelous tale. Please, Mister, about how racing started. I mean, such fantastic characters.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
And great dogs too, like old Jerry.
Well, for our listeners, we're going to put up some links to sources for you to purchase the book. It's a great book. Don't miss out on it if you're a Greyhound lover. It's an essential part of your Greyhound library.
Thank you.
Well, now, Charlie, if we can just come up with a few $1 million, we can make some of these movies.
Yeah.
And we'll put you in as the casting director, and maybe we'll get Julian Fellows to write the script for it. And
the only thing I'd say, John, is that like Alfred Hitchcock, I would insist on appearing in a scene myself.
That's right. You can walk, you can walk behind the characters or something like that.
Yes, the man.
That was always fun.
The man walking behind the bookmakers.
Yes, yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Well, it's not outside the realm of possibilities. One of the things that the kind of movies that I like a great deal are these movies made of little-known stories in history, no matter what they're about. And some of them have been great hit movies. Some film director or producer picked up on an idea that he was fascinated by and said, "This would make a good movie. Let's make a movie out of it." So, hope springs eternal that there'll be somebody like that who will pick up on one of these stories and turn it into a movie. And there's so many outlets now, not just first-run movie theaters, but also the streaming services, Netflix, Amazon Prime, et cetera. So there's all kinds of possibilities for folks that might want to tell a great dog story, because everybody loves dog stories, and pick up and make one of these movies.
Perhaps we get Ken Burns to make a documentary.
Yes, indeed. Well, Charlie, it's been a wonderful hour. Thank you for spending it with us.
Thank you, John.
Telling these great stories. Well, listeners, thanks again. We will see you at the next episode. See you next time.
Thanks so much for listening to the show. You can follow Greyhound Nation wherever you get your podcasts. If you've been listening for a while, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, etc. You can also write to us via the contact form on our website, greyhoundnation.dog. That's greyhoundnation.dog. We're also on Facebook. Search for our Grey Nation Show page. You can also tweet at us. It's at Grey Nation Show on Twitter. If you're an Instagram user, we're there too. Just follow us at Grey Nation Show. This episode was produced in collaboration with host John Parker. Our theme music was composed and performed by Dimitri Taras. Thanks to Charlie Blanning for joining us for a third time on the podcast. That's a record for Greyhound Nation guests. If you want to read more stories like the ones Charlie shared in this episode, get yourself a copy of his new book, Please Mr., The Golden Age of Greyhound Racing. Check out our show notes to learn more about how to order via eBay and Facebook. I'm Michael Burns, and you've been listening to Greyhound Nation.